Good evening. I'm Bill Brown of Brookings Mountain West, so on behalf of my colleagues in UNLV, a special thanks for coming out tonight. I don't know if any of you heard, but there's an election going on. And so I hope you set your recorders for the other important talk that's going on tonight. Right? But thank you very much for coming here. We'll try and make it worth your while, and I know our speaker will. Tom Wright is here from Brookings. Tom is a fellow at Brookings and is part of their Managing Global Order program. I don't know if I'm envious or sympathetic of a job title which includes Managing Global Order, but he will talk about that program and his research interests and what's going on in this seemingly ever chaotic world, including some news events of today and how foreign policy may or may not play an important part in the election. Let me just tell you a little bit about Tom. In addition to being a fellow at Brookings, he was executive director of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, a lecturer at the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago, a senior researcher at the Princeton Project on National Security. His PhD is from Georgetown University. He has a master's in philosophy from Cambridge University. His BA and MAs are from the University College at Dublin. As you might expect of someone with his credentials and expertise, he is well published in the academic and professional literature, but you'll also see his name on public newspaper and media websites. And we're fortunate to have him here today to talk to us on foreign affairs. Tom?
Thank you, Bill, for that very generous introduction, and thanks to everyone here at UNLV for inviting me to speak. I'm delighted to be here. It's only my second time in Las Vegas. The last time was about 14 years ago, so a lot has changed since. Bill mentioned that I'm with the Managing Global Order project at Brookings. That project usually elicits one of a couple of responses. The first is, you're not doing a very good job on managing global order, or, you know, could you come up with something a little bit more ambitious? It sounds rather humble. So, but our job is really to try to look at some of the issues that cut across the different regions and the different issue areas. So not just to look at foreign policy in terms of China and Russia and Europe and Latin America, or even in energy, nuclear weapons, but to try to bring it all together to see what are some of the big trends in world politics and the international order. And so I want to talk to you about that here this evening. I'm particularly grateful for everyone coming, given that it's an election debate. If this is the first you're hearing about the election debate, I'll forgive you if you run out the door to catch it in 20 minutes, or if you're checking Twitter or the or your mobile devices frantically. I know that something is up. But I think that, you know, the foreign policy debate in the election so far has been really touching on some of the emergency issues that have come up, the urgent issues like Libya, Egypt and others. And we haven't heard that much yet about the big picture, but this has been out there for the past few years, especially since the financial crisis, about America's role in the world and whether or not the United States will be as powerful in the 21st century as it was in the 20th. And I'm reminded sometimes when we broach this topic of the story of the Emperor of Japan, Emperor Hirohito, when the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He had to go on Japanese radio to explain to his population that he was advocating unconditional surrender. And his words were, the war situation has developed not necessarily to our advantage. I think in the United States over the last 10 years, maybe since 9/11, but especially since the financial crisis, there is a sense that the world situation is developing, but not necessarily to our advantage. It's hard to put a finger on exactly what it is that is going wrong, but there are lots of things, if you just look at the newspapers over the last few days, that will jump out. One, obviously, is the international financial crisis, which continues unabated in Europe and does threaten the very premise of the global economy and makes it much more difficult to recover from the recession here in the United States. A second is the turmoil in the Middle East and the side of anti-American protests, following on massive anti-American protests earlier on over the past 10 years since 9/11, and the fall of American-friendly regimes, sometimes undemocratic, which results in mixed feelings here. But there's a sense that it is spinning a little bit out of control. And we saw the latest incident of that today in Syria, with the border skirmish between Turkey and Syria that could trend in a negative direction over the next few days. A third area is maritime competition in the South China Sea. I don't know if you've seen this over the last few weeks, but anti-Japanese protests in China, China going into Japan's territorial waters around the Senkaku Islands, concerns that the US might be pulled in, and that's just symptomatic of a broader competition between China and its neighbours in the South China and East China Seas that also could get out of control and threaten the global economy as well as regional stability. And finally, but last but not least, the fiscal cliff in America's financial situation, which makes people worried about America's ability, not just Americans, but also America's friends overseas, worried about America's ability to continue to exercise leadership in the international community over the next 50 years or so. So there's a lot of questions out there, and a lot of people are trying to predict what will happen over the next 4 or 5 decades. Plenty of people have written books or articles saying that this century will be the Chinese century. Others say it will continue to be the American century, and others still say it will be no one's world, that it will be an apolar world that's sort of a free-for-all with everybody competing with everyone else, nobody in charge, no international organization, no state, and that chaos could ensue. I find these predictions limited in value because I think it's extremely difficult to predict anything in world politics, simply because it's so complex that whatever we predict for a year or two's time, let alone for 10, 50 years' time, is extremely contingent upon events. If you look back at the 20th century, and if you imagine that we were having this conversation in 1912, it would be very difficult to say that the 20th century would have turned out the way that it turned out. Many of the words and concepts that are now used to describe the 20th century didn't really even exist or weren't widely understood in 1912. Nuclear weapons wasn't something people would know very much about in 1912. Genocide wasn't coined until several years later during World War I. Bolshevik revolutionism hadn't happened yet. Communism was known, but the variant of it that emerged later wasn't. Nazism wasn't known about, but yet all of these things proved to be critically important and were completely unforeseeable. I mean, no one could possibly have imagined that those events or movements would have emerged in the century. Plus, the economic turmoil or the major world wars or simply the strategic decisions that countries took meant that the century went through several twists and turns. So when we have these discussions about predicting where the next century is going to go, I sort of think that this is a little bit like having speculation, amongst fans before the baseball season or the football season about who will win. It's a lot of fun, and we can talk about whether the Yankees or someone else is going to win the World Series at the beginning of the season, but we don't know. And even if a team is favourite, the favourites often lose, right? They often don't actually win at the end of the day, even if they win more times over many instances than others. So this is pre-season commentary to a degree, and I think we should avoid it. What I want to try to do is not give you a prediction about where the century will end up, but I want to try to describe what I think some of the terms of the competition or terms of the international order are going to be over the next 10 years that may go some way to determining whether the United States can compete effectively in it, and particularly in terms of its relations with China. And what I want to try to talk about are two sort of different elements that I think are at play in the international order. And the first the first major element is sort of interdependence between countries. And this is, I think, something we've grown a little bit used to over the last 20 years, that the international order that existed since World War II and initially took place between Western countries expanded after the Cold War to include all countries. We all now trade with each other. We are all heavily interdependent in terms of a recession in Europe or a collapse in Europe will affect the US economy, but not just the US economy, also the Chinese and other Asian economies. China has massive holdings still of US debt. The United States gets many of its precious metal and resources from Asia. But China in turn is dependent upon Western markets for its exports. So there is a complex interdependence between countries. And not only is it occurring at the economic level, but culturally and politically, we're much more intertwined than ever before. There are shared challenges. It is impossible for any one country to deal with the problem of climate change. It's impossible for any one country to protect itself against pandemic diseases. There are many transnational challenges that can only be solved with cooperation between countries. And meanwhile, all of this takes place against a shifting center of gravity to Asia, to the Asia Pacific and away from the Atlantic, where their interdependence is of a very different form than in Europe, but still exists, albeit not as institutionalized as in the EU. So the first major characteristic, I would say, is this sort of interdependence that selects for cooperation. But the second, which is less hopeful perhaps, is that the preconditions for much more serious competition between states are present in today's world and are already having an effect. We've seen since 2008 that China, and I would date this from the financial crisis, not from the change in administration here, because a lot of the indicators are that that's what sort of drove this shift. But China's ambition became more pronounced in 2008 as it saw the US in decline following the collapse of Lehman Brothers. It became more assertive in its region, and that assertion caused a reaction in other states, that they became more fearful in response. They wanted closer ties to the US, but they became much more concerned about their own security and fearful of the future. The arms sales since the Cold War, I think, are at an all-time high since the Cold War, not before it, or not during it, but they are at a post-Cold War high, and that's almost exclusively driven by arms sales in the Middle East and in Asia, not in Europe. And the US defense spending is a part of that, but the dramatic shift is in Asia. Another precondition is nationalism. Nationalism is on the rise pretty much the world over, particularly in Asia, as we're seeing in these maritime disputes, which, by the way, are often over rocks that are uninhabited and quite small. I saw some pictures of these recently where some of them are actually underwater for part of the day. So they're not even fully sort of over, they're not inhabitable at all. But because part of the claims depend on whether they're inhabited, the countries have been trying to sort of place outdoor furniture or other things on them to say that they, use them on occasion, or that they are part of their sovereign territory. But there are lots of competing claims there, but nationalism extends beyond that. It extends to the Middle East, where we're seeing a lot of these new regimes and post-revolutionary societies, more than anything else, have a pride in their nationality and want to have autonomous foreign policies. That's all well and good, and much of that is to be applauded, but it also means that on occasion those different identities can clash with each other. Those different ambitions can clash with each other, and I think we are seeing some of that. And even in Europe, where the euro crisis has wreaked havoc on the EU, we see a rise in populism. I wouldn't overstate it. It's not a return to the 1930s or anything like that, but we are seeing an increase in popular movements that are more rejectionist of European integration. Some quite nasty, most pretty mainstream. I mean, some of the nasty ones in Greece, the neo-Nazi organization Golden Dawn and some other groups around Europe. But in general, you know, that's a very negative element. But in general, there's actually a broader sort of increase in just countries that are in parties that are sick and tired of having to go along with the European way, whether that's in the core being worried about paying for the periphery, or whether that's in the periphery worried about having austerity imposed upon them. And that will increase even if the extremist movements are contained. Another precondition, a third precondition, is resource scarcity, which is leading countries to be more competitive about how they access energy. And this is particularly true, again, in Asia, where population growth and economic growth is just giving India and China in particular an insatiable thirst for energy resources. And ironically, they are becoming more dependent upon the Middle East at a time when the United States, because of shale gas, is becoming less dependent on the Middle East, and the US may decrease its dependence on Middle Eastern oil considerably over the next 10 years. And a fourth precondition for competition is that there are many emerging issues that aren't covered by international law or international institutions that really cause tensions between states. We've seen the drone warfare here in the US, that there's a concern that when that spreads to other countries, you know, how will that play out if Russia begins to use that in its near abroad, or China similarly? That would seem likely to cause tension between countries. Cyber warfare, which has been a major controversy over the last few years, not just in the offensive use of cyber weapons, but also in the long-term sort of theft of international property, particularly by China here in the US. So these issues aren't covered by any existing agreements, and they're giving rise to more tensions and competition between countries. So we have these two different dynamics. We have interdependence on the one hand and competition on the other hand, and they exist simultaneously, and any strategy will have to be able to accommodate both. We can't deny one or the other. It's easier to go just to concentrate on one and say it's all about competition and geopolitical competition, but then there are all these problems that won't be dealt with because you need cooperation. But if you only cooperate, then the geopolitical competition, particularly in East Asia, will and potentially in the Middle East, could spiral out of control, and you may see conflict. So this sort of twin track poses particular problems, I think, for U.S. strategy, because the international order that the United States built after World War II with the help of its friends and allies overseas, that has continued in various forms for better or worse since that time, was originally built for countries that shared common interests. You'll remember that the Soviet Union, after an initial outreach effort, was not a part of that order for the most part. It was a member of the United Nations, but it really was completely independent of the West. I think at any one given year for most of the Cold War, the number of Soviet students in the United States was less than 100. There was very little trade apart from grain or some other commodities between the West, between the United States and the Soviet Union, a little bit more between Western European countries and the Soviet Union for most of the Cold War. So you had interdependence within the order between friends, but outside you had the enemies or adversaries of NATO and the United States were completely independent. And so you could have this containment policy that was quite an aggressive competition policy, ultimately designed to collapse the Soviet Union. And then you could have unbridled cooperation with friends and allies, and both of those could exist. But they could only exist because those two worlds are separate. But now those two worlds have fused together. The United States is also used to putting countries in categories that are sort of clear and consistent. You know, that a country is either sort of a friend and an ally, in which case it poses no danger, no threat, or it is an enemy, in which case you can't cooperate with them at all, and you may not even negotiate with them most of the time. But the world that we're heading into is, I think, a great deal more muddled than that, and much more complex than that. The most likely competitor of the US, China, will be a partner on occasion, and it will be a competitor on other occasions. The word foe is too strong a term to describe China, but the word friend is too generous as well, because there is legitimate competition between those two countries. But how that will fit into our sort of frame of reference in strategy will be difficult. And finally, you know, interdependence we've assumed for many years to be a positive thing. I mean, anyone here who took political science, interdependence breeds sort of familiarity and friendship and harmony over time, because countries that trade with each other tend not to fight each other. Cordell Hull, who was FDR's Secretary of State in the early 1940s during World War II, said if goods don't cross borders, armies will, saying that free trade is important. And he was right to a considerable degree. But we're now also learning that interdependence between countries that have clashing interests is actually also has some risk attached to it. And the primary risk is that countries will miscalculate. They will believe that they can push others because they can't possibly respond because they're interdependent. So, you know, China may say, well, we can do this against the US because we hold so much of its debt, they won't be able to respond. Or we could say, you know, we can push China on this, but because they export so much to us, then they won't be able to respond. But when nationalism and politics takes hold, you can often be wrong. And that's a lesson of the European experience in the 19th century, when those countries are interdependent, but were still frequently in conflict with each other. So it is a difficult issue. There are three sort of options that have been laid out in different forms, sort of ways in which the US could engage with this problem, things that the strategies the United States could adopt. And I think all three are unsatisfactory. I'll just go through them briefly. The first is that the United States could just give way to the next rising power. You know, that the United States should just give most of Asia to China, see the sphere of influence. Why should the United States be the dominant country in Asia anyway, since it is a rather sort of unnatural state of affairs? China is rising, so the argument goes, so they have a legitimate claim to be the hegemon in the region, as long as they promise not to go much further beyond that. And that, I think, is an extremely destabilizing strategy, because it is one that would overnight, I mean, think of it this way, if Rand Paul was elected president of the United States, this is probably the policy he would pursue, right? It's an isolationist policy, for better or worse. I mean, people may legitimately support the strategy, but the strategy would be that the United States is overextended. There's too many commitments around the world, so let's pull back all of the overseas bases that are in over 100 countries around the world, but particularly in the Middle East and Asia, bring American troops home, not honor or pull out of existing treaties which oblige the United States to come to the defense of other countries in all sorts of circumstances, and then let history take its course. And the idea is either that China will be the dominant power in Asia, or other countries would check it, that there would be a natural check and balance. If that was to come to pass, if this hypothetical Rand Paul presidency came into being, the very next day there would be tremendous uncertainty all over the world. It would be a whole new world where countries would try to hedge against this new environment, and they would take matters into their own hands. And it may be safer for a time for the US, but I think in the long run, we'd be at great risk of running into a World War I scenario where the conflicts got so great that it would drag the US in anyway, and it would be hard to avoid. It's hard to see how the global economy could continue under such circumstances. So I think just pulling back, or giving up anything that was contentious outside of America's immediate area, is a strategy that will be destabilizing and counterproductive. The second strategy is to compete ferociously with rising powers and contain them in the same way that the United States contained the Soviet Union. So let's just contain China. Let's just try to prevent it from growing very much. This is more maybe like the John Bolton, strategy, the sort of rather hawkish Republican foreign policy, former ambassador to the UN and former foreign policy official. And in that world, again, that sounds sort of attractive in a way. I mean, the containment worked during the Cold War, right? So why wouldn't it work today? The problem with this is that it is, in its own way, immensely destabilizing because it completely ignores all of the interdependence in the world. It completely ignores all of the shared interests that the United States has with China. It ignores the fact that China's neighbors want to be allies with the United States, but they are also inextricably linked economically to China. And the one thing, if you go to Singapore or Vietnam or even Australia, countries that are strong supporters of the US now geopolitically, the one thing many people will say, or virtually all will say, is that they never want to be forced to choose between the US and China. So even if they're very pro-American, they want to be pro-American while also being pro-China economically. And this strategy would force them to choose. And in that eventuality, it is quite possible that they would not choose the US because their economic future is so dependent upon China, and China is so much closer to it that they can't simply go away. China has many points of leverage over them. So the simply winning or winning the battle or the competition outright or containing China is not really a very good option either. And the third option, which sounds like a nice sort of blend of the two, is sharing power. How about we just share power with China? The United States, an Australian former defense official called Hugh White recently wrote a book that's quite influential, albeit not all that popular in Australian foreign policy circles, called the China choice. And his argument was that since these other two options are not very satisfactory, the United States should share power with China. The US, Japan, India and China should all sit in a room together and decide how to allocate power in Asia. The United States would have certain countries, China would have other countries, maybe in Indochina and parts of Southeast Asia. India and Japan would also have their sphere of influence, and it would function as a concert of Asia in the same way the historians here will know that we had a concert of Europe after the Napoleonic Wars, where European countries shared power and major war didn't occur for just over 100, for just 99 years until 1914. So that seems like quite a success, and it also has much that would seem to be attractive on the surface. After all, sharing power seems like a responsible thing to do. That would seem to be a fair way out. But I don't think this would work either, because it is completely unrealistic and undesirable in today's world that a handful of big countries would sit down and carve up the future of small countries and what their future will look like. That if a country like Singapore or a democratic country like Australia or many other, Indonesia, would like to pursue a certain path, that large countries would sit down and say, we are not giving you that option. You will have to put up with domination by one country or another, that we're going to go back to these old imperial spheres of influence. The United States may be the dominant power in Asia today, but it is only because it has been invited in and asked to stay by the countries there. There has been a dramatic surge in the desire of Southeast Asian countries to have close ties to the US since 2008. But that's only because they see the US as much less threatening than the alternative, and they know the United States will leave if asked. So a concert of Asia will completely go against that. It would also, the idea that you would carve these countries up in a sphere of influence way would destroy, I think, any faith in international law and international order anywhere else in the world. We'd be going back to the age of emperors and dictators. And I don't think that will be particularly desirable. So I don't think any of these three strategies are really satisfactory or will work in any way. So we need a fourth option. I don't have the full contours of that, but I just want to maybe tell you a little bit over the next 10 minutes on that, and then we can open it up to questions and just a conversation. But I think for this fourth option, there are a couple of two key questions. The first question is, how do we compete responsibly in an interdependent world? What does responsible competition mean? How does the United States fulfill its obligations as a great power, as a treaty ally of many countries around the world, as a country that, despite all of its faults, many countries look to protect their own security or to uphold international law, however inconsistently and however imperfectly, is still by far and away the best option for those countries? How do we balance that with this interdependence? What does responsible competition mean? And the second question is, how do we preserve and strengthen the architecture of cooperation, given that there are so many problems that are not covered by existing institutions, and that countries' interests clash so fundamentally that that it is almost impossible to imagine Russia, China, and the United States cooperating or agreeing on anything to do with cyber warfare, for instance. And that's just you can get to a certain point, but only very low down, and then it's hard to see where it goes from there. So how do you manage to strengthen the architecture of cooperation given those differences? And I would just suggest 4 general principles that I think might provide some sort of basis for a strategy. The first is, I think we need to create an international order that is somewhat autonomous and can survive any single country from leaving it. So you want something that is open to all countries but isn't dependent upon the support and cooperation of each of them. So if Russia or China were to decide that they were to completely undermine the order, which they haven't done yet, but if they were, say on maritime security or on something else, or if China's future political environment took a turn for the worse, and the regime that's currently there, that is authoritarian but is also somewhat status quo oriented, with a couple of exceptions, but somewhat status quo oriented, if that took a turn for the worse, we would want to ensure that the order could survive and prosper even though they did that. So in Asia, that means building a stable and robust regional order that is open to China to join, and that they should be encouraged very much to be a part of, and that will be stronger for their participation, but is still capable of functioning even if they are not fully a part of it, or even if they don't offer the cooperation. So I think that's very different than a one world sort of approach where everyone is so interdependent that if any one country sort of falls out, that the others can't really work together. The second is that I think it's important to begin to engage the toughest sort of questions in the multilateral order. Drones, cyber warfare, arms races in Asia, climate change, the questions that have really divided countries or have sort of gone unaddressed over the last 10 years or so, we need to begin to engage with those. One example I'm sort of particularly fond of is that in the first year and a half of this administration, they focused very heavily on the New START agreement with Russia. And the idea here was to have a marginally greater reduction in strategic nuclear weapons, in addition to the previous START treaties that the US and Russia had signed going back to the 1970s. That in many ways is a very worthwhile endeavour, but I wonder how relevant that is over the long term of history, given that the primary problem, one of the primary problems in arms control today is the fact that China is developing conventional ballistic missiles that are completely unaffected by any treaty that can be used against US forces and US allies in Asia. And maybe the United States has some weapons that China's concerned about too, and that's not the subject of any treaty negotiation. So in 20 years' time, when we look back at arms control over this decade, will we say it was a tremendous success because it was an incremental improvement in Russia-US relations, or will we say it was a failure because it completely ignored the gathering storm that ultimately broke out sometime in 2019 or 2020? I mean, only history will tell, and I hope I'm wrong about that, but I think it's important to begin to engage those difficult issues. The third principle is that the United States, I think, needs to make a distinction between balancing and containing China. Containment, as we knew it during the Cold War, was actually an extremely aggressive strategy. It was designed at every point to weaken the Soviet Union and to force it out of Eastern Europe ultimately. And it was measured in how it did that, but that was the intention and the goal. And George Kennan, the architect in many respects of containment, made this clear in the mid-1940s when he said, ultimately, it will have been successful if it causes the Soviet Union to implode from within. I don't think that we want China to implode from within. I mean, granted, it would be good if China became more democratic, but it is not a US objective to try to weaken China or prevent it from growing. A growing China is good for the United States. A strong Chinese economy is good for the United States. Balancing is a very different strategy. Balancing means ensuring that there is a status quo or an equilibrium that is only changed when countries agree to change it of their own free will or sort of naturally over time. It is not something that is designed to cause a revolution either in the collapse of China or Chinese expansion. It is very difficult to understand precisely what is perceived as balancing and what is perceived as containment by China, but I think that's something we need to engage in and to have a balancing strategy rather than a containment strategy. And the final principle is just to continue to lead in the world while also fixing the problems here at home, particularly on the budget and other long-term economic problems, because countries may believe the president, whoever he or she is, if they say that the United States needs a strong role in the world, but they may doubt the credibility of that if they don't see progress on, in Washington on the budget or on other issues. So it will be important to pay attention to the problems here at home as well as the ones overseas. I think that if we have this sort of strategic discussion, we may end up with an international order that can continue to play a role in the world that it did since World War II. It will be a different order. It won't be the same as it was before, but I think it will be sort of more realistic and more attuned to our sort of needs and challenges over the next 20 or 30 years. I don't know how it will end out. That's a prediction that I won't get into, but I think it will strengthen the hand of those who want some stability and to continue to see the best parts of the old order preserved and strengthened. So I think I'll end it there and just I think we'll open it up to questions. Yeah.
Yes, that really sounds like a good approach there, that third comment. But one of the things I focus on in some of my writing and blogging is those concepts also of balance, but also sustainability. I mean, some things can't grow forever. So I sort of tried to put those two factors out there, balance and sustainability. And maybe we can work that all across the board. And certainly when it comes to trade, it's interesting, you said there was one trend, which I'm sure you were aware of, from the 19th to the 20th century, and that was the sort of, and it culminated with World War I think, the decline of Britain and some of the things they were doing in the world with mercantilism and so on. And I'm seeing a little bit of that with China. So I guess the question is, let me formulate that in terms of questions. How important do you think, like, trade balance with a good percentage of domestic production for each and every country, with the overall umbrella of also some things can only be sustained, like we probably can't go beyond 10 billion people, we only have so much fossil fuel. So those two things, that sustainability and balance.
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and sustainability is obviously very important, because if you can't sustain your strength, it will run out, obviously, by definition. So I think you're right on that. I think on the trade front. I mean, what concerns me at the moment is that the United States, this is partly because of the recession, is not trading as much as it should be. You know, the president has ratified free trade agreements with, I think it's Colombia, South Korea, and Panama, but hasn't really initiated new ones. And the trade talks with the EU are slow in starting. The Doha round is obviously pretty much dead or unlikely to come back anytime soon. Some of this, I think, is understandable because there needs to be an appropriate balance at a time of, you know, economic hardship, that there's, you know, that jobs are protected at home for whatever country is engaged in those negotiations. But if you look at the trade figures at the moment, the industrialized countries are actually declining as a percentage of overall trade, and developing countries, particularly developing Asian countries, are increasing dramatically. And for most countries, the percentage that of their trade is actually under 50% for the industrialized countries for the first time, and over 50% for the emerging and developing economies for the first time. China's the exception, obviously, because it is counted as a developing country, so most of its trade is with industrialized countries. But that is, you know, something that's good in a respect, because it shows that there's increased economic vitality in those countries, and that's a positive thing. But part of it's because, you know, there's been less exports here, and I think that's something that, you know, that whoever is elected in November will want to try to rectify. Yeah, over here.
You left unstated how this order gets organized. I mean, either it's not obviously going to be anarchy. You have some idea of a guiding hand, which you don't say, but I assume you mean the United States, because you occasionally use we,
yeah,
and so forth. So, you know, so you continue to see a position of the, instead you, in effect, you vote on the side of the continuing American. You don't see China organizing this order.
That's right.
Right.
Yeah.
And then the sort of follow-up question is, what do you think about institutionalization of the order? Because you now are reaching it into areas where, as you said, there's currently anarchy.
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I think there's no sort of alternative really to American leadership on this, because the other countries that could lead either don't want to, or if they did, in, say, China's case, they would lead in quite a different direction. I don't think they would lead in a direction that was, you know, extremely negative like the Soviet Union, but they wouldn't be doing, I think, what the US or what the US and its allies have done over the last 60 or 70 years. So I think that it is important that the US continues to lead, that this order cannot survive without American leadership. Other countries will play a part, but they will not be able to play the leading role. I think it's a very important question about how you structure it. I think a lot of different things will need to come into the mix, because no one institution, there's no institutional fix. You know, there's no one institution that can run this, partly because the countries have genuinely different interests in many of these questions. So I think you need, you know, you'll need still the formal institutions, but you may need smaller institutions too, say on cyber. You know, would it be, I don't know, would it be a good idea for the United States to begin to build a coalition of the like-minded and to find countries that can agree on rules of the road up to a certain point? And then there may be other countries that are outside of that, but you could negotiate with them en masse. So maybe it would be more of a minilateral, you know, coalition, selective coalition according to sort of interests and what countries believed in. Then I think you also need, for countries that are outside of it, strong bilateral relations too. You know, whatever happens, there should always be a strong bilateral relationship between the US and China, the US and India, you know, the US and Brazil, and between those countries themselves. Because the more countries that are talking, I think, it doesn't solve everything, but it means that you have slightly more certainty and more information. Yeah.
Yeah, you just mentioned the other BRICS, the other countries. Do you see them continuing to prosper economically at the same rate as China over the next 10 years?
I think a big question is whether China will continue to prosper economically at the same rate as it has. So I wouldn't take it for granted that it will. And you know, if China doesn't, I'll get back to your question in a second, but if China doesn't grow, that's a problem as much as well, I don't know if it's as much or less, but it's a problem as well as it growing. So, there are challenges here either way. It's not something that will be solved by whatever the growth rates are, sort of higher or lower. In terms of the other countries, the other sort of emerging economies, Brazil is doing quite well, India is doing quite well, but they all have big challenges. And if I was to choose any challenges, I'd probably choose the challenges that the US has, because I think they're fixable if the politics can get right. And I'm an optimist, and I think that over time there will be more cooperation in Washington. Maybe that's naive, but the problems the other countries face are more structural. India has enormous issues of capacity as well as resources and other issues. So so I think that they all face challenges. But I think that it would be a good thing if they continue to grow, because growth, it's important in the current environment to have growth from somewhere. Yeah, lady here, then behind.
So many of the borders created after World War II were almost arbitrary at times. Do you think the rewriting of these borders, for example, Sudan and South Sudan, Bosnia and Herzegovina, these separations on both national, ethnic, and religious values is good or bad for stability of the region?
I think it's probably if it happens in a orderly way, it's probably good, right? I mean, it's a little bit of a cop-out, but if they agree on those changes, that's a good thing. But I don't think we can begin to rewrite borders, because it makes more sense, according to objective criteria, because the minute you do that, then there are lots of people who are adversely affected, lots of people who want to take advantage of that, and then you have a lot of instability. I mean, the borders in the Middle East, are relatively artificial, obviously, because they date back to the world wars, but they are sort of what we have, and to begin to change them because objective criteria would suggest that they should be something else, I think is something we should only do with extreme caution, and when the overwhelming case is that it would be better for stability and it would be sort of widely welcomed, or it's just a fact, that a war has occurred and it's just a fact, and then it's ratified. That was sort of the case in the Balkans, when the agreements eventually were just based on facts on the ground, which no one would have desired at the time, because there was a lot of pain and misery that resulted in those facts coming into place. But once they were, it was something that probably made sense to recognize. Just the lady behind you, and then the gentleman behind.
Okay. Yeah. You mentioned a global institution. It makes me think of League of Nations, then the United Nations, and now here we have a new world almost 100 years later. And all efforts generated in many ways from the United States. What is your vision for this sort of platform, if that's the right metaphor, for this new way of approaching?
Yeah, I think the UN will continue to play a role, but I don't think it's not a silver bullet. It has lots and lots and lots of flaws. It won't be a way to sort of organize the world or a governing authority ever, I think, because it is ultimately a collection of countries that each has its interests and each protect those interests vigorously. And so when they disagree, nothing happens. When they agree, sometimes they may even get it wrong, but most of the time on difficult issues, it can be very hard for them to agree. And no major country will place its security and interests in the hands of the UN, because for the United States, that would mean, giving China a veto, Russia a veto. For them, it would mean, giving the US a veto. So I would be, realistic that I don't think the dreams of some of the founders of these organizations will ever be realized. But at the same time, that doesn't mean they're useless, right? I mean, it's important to have a forum where countries can come together and talk, even if they don't accomplish very much. And they actually do accomplish quite a lot on a lot of areas, many of which are uncontroversial, but peacekeeping and development assistance and other areas, they can be quite good. So I see more continuity. The big question is, can the UN be reformed to bring in new member states into the UN Security Council as permanent members? And I think that would be very hard to do, just because of the geopolitics of it, that China's objecting to Japan, potentially has concerns about India. Would Germany get a seat, in which case it would be the third European seat? There are lots of issues there, but it's a long-term goal, because it would be good to bring more countries in to reflect the world as it is now, rather than as it was in 1945. But I think that it would be very challenging. Yes?
Thank you for a very thought-provoking lecture. Even though the date is sort of an interesting one in terms of the size of this audience, I think it's wonderful to see the number of people here to hear your thoughts on this issue. My question relates to the gentleman's first question with regard to sustainability and balance. And correct me if my facts are wrong. First, we're borrowing 43 cents of every dollar we spend. Second, we are spending more money on defense than all other countries combined. Third, you suggested that we've been invited around the world. I have some questions about that. But if we have been invited around the world, how about asking those individuals to help in the cost that it takes to be in as a protector in those areas? So really the question is sustainability. I don't see how we can sustain this amount of expense, whether it be domestically or foreign, at the current rate without going bankrupt as the Soviet Union did. Second, I don't see balance here with regard to our allies and our efforts. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, it's a great series of points, and it's it's a real sort of concern, I think, that exists, and it's well founded. I think I have a slightly different view on some of it, but it's not one that you can prove sort of one way or the other. But I think it sort of depends on the second point. I'll get back to the economic issue, but on the burden, what we call sort of burden sharing between the US and its allies. It depends on what you see the benefits as sort of being. So some people would argue that the price of leadership is basically shouldering that additional share of the burden. That what the United States gets in exchange is a relatively stable world where it doesn't get dragged into major wars and conflicts that will cost many multiples of the defense budget today, and potentially have much greater disastrous consequences as well. And so, free riding, other countries basically, free riding in the US has been a problem since the end of World War II. There's always been concerns about that because sometimes they know that the United States is going to stay, and so they can just free ride a little bit. On other occasions, they may feel they're doing a lot already. And on other occasions still, it's actually a good thing they don't spend that much. I mean, if you take the case of Japan, part of the US-Japan treaty is essentially designed to prevent Japan from spending money on its defense because it would frighten its neighbors. So if the United States takes care of Japan's security, it's perceived as less threatening by Korea, South Korea, North Korea, and China than it would be if Japan did it itself. I mean, just think about nuclear weapons. The United States has a nuclear umbrella over Japan. It's committed to defending Japan as the US government would defend Chicago or Las Vegas or New York, right? That in many ways doesn't make very much sense until you realize that if Japan had nuclear weapons, it could set in train a big arms race in the region that would ultimately hurt US interests by dragging the US in. So I think that there's a real debate over what an appropriate level of burden sharing is. Just in my opinion is that there's probably not enough burden sharing with Europe, that Europe could do more than it is, and they are cutting their defense budgets pretty drastically, but that will be very hard to reverse because they just don't perceive the world as being very dangerous. And they're because in many ways they're not in the Middle East, they don't have a presence in Asia, they don't have the responsibilities that the US sort of military has in terms of number of allies and number of treaty sort of commitments. So that is an issue. I think in the Middle East and in Asia, it's not so much of an issue actually that those countries do actually spend quite a lot and do quite a lot. So I think there is more burden sharing there. Some people may argue they could do a little bit more, but I don't think they are sort of free riding to the extent that maybe Western Europe is. But again, that's a function of their sort of geopolitical environment. On the first question on economics, I think it's a real long-term issue. I'm not sure how much of a short-term issue it is because, as you know, there's a debate about the appropriate balance between austerity to reduce the debt and recovery to get out of the recession. And we know that recessions from financial crises are much longer and more protracted than recessions from other causes. So there's a debate about that, but I think everyone should be agreed that in the medium and long term, the debt is a real issue, that it's important to get to grips with it. And if Washington and the country doesn't get to grips with it, then then there's a real problem, I think. So yeah, just this gentleman here and then.
What do you think the likelihood is that China will attempt some form of military action just as a form of flexing muscle sometime in the next century, similar to the Russo-Japanese War, where the Japanese, beat the Russians, and it was just a huge shock to the world stage that here Japan is a major power now. Since China, yeah, they launched their first aircraft carrier, but it's not even theirs, it's Russian. But they're at least attempting to increase their military, and they're building up their GDP, which GDP is excellent way to, bring up your military. And they moved to the QBZ assault rifle, which is not a comm block ammunition anymore. It's their own cartridge. So I'm just wondering what your thoughts on that.
I mean, I think I would distinguish between some of the, first, a century is a long time, so it's hard to know if it will or won't. But in terms of the foreseeable future, I think there are certain red lines. Like there's a difference between building up your military and building advanced weapons to make your military stronger, some of which will be used against the US and other countries in Asia in the event of a conflict. That's something the United States is doing. When the US military is building up weapons for contingencies involving China. There's a difference between that and using force in an aggressive way in their region. And so I think what we've seen so far is that they are becoming more assertive in terms of, laying claim to various maritime territories that maybe are disputed or other issues. But, there was some sort of clashes, fishing vessels and the like, and various issues arising out of that. But they haven't. I think it would be an enormous gamble for them to actually do that, because it would unite many countries against them, which is something they wouldn't want to. They shouldn't want to do. From a strategic point of view. So I suspect they will try to avoid that. But there are various scenarios, right, that come into play. If their economy tanked and the population was very restless and they needed a unifying, sort of device, like a nationalist device, a lot of people are worried about, relations across the Taiwan Strait or contingencies involving the collapse of North Korea or other things that they may overreach. So the danger does exist, but my suspicion it would be more inadvertent than deliberate. Like it would arise out of a crisis rather than out of a sort of a grand design. Was there another? Yeah.
What are your thoughts on the awareness and interest of the mass public in foreign affairs, and how important a variable do you believe this will be in the coming years in predicting the United States' actions at an international level?
I think it's mixed. I tend to be more optimistic than some of my friends, but I think people do pay attention, but I think that they need, we're still all struggling for sort of a narrative and framework, right? So it's no surprise to me that people are struggling, who just follow this, and the newspapers are struggling with this too, because everyone's struggling with it. And I think people do pay attention to the news, and they are concerned about events overseas. I think it's easy, for everyone to get the wrong information, but not just members of the public, but also, the intelligence community and the US government as well. So it's hard. There's a lot of information out there. It's more easily accessible than ever before, but it's still extremely hard to analyze it and to understand what's important and what isn't. There's a lot of noise. So I think it will be very important how to navigate that, with all of this information, how to know what what is the closest approximation to the truth, I guess. I don't know if there is a definitive truth in these things. It's always a matter of interpretation. But I think that will be difficult. But I think people are aware that the future of the country is, at least in part, dependent on the future of the world. Is there any? Come back once. Okay, yeah. Is there any other questions? I think because we're running out of time, so I might take them together if there are. No, great, perfect.
Just really quick.
Yeah.
You spoke briefly on containment before, and you're talking a lot about the volatility of the maritime region. I was reading somewhere that we're going to, as the U.S. as foreign policy, increase more U.S. bases and forces in Australia.
Yeah.
As like a sort of control of the maritime region and trade.
Yeah.
Is that a smart move? Is that like?
Yeah, I think it. I mean, this is a plan to rotate Marines through Darwin, a base in Darwin, Australia, and it's sort of born out of concern that the United States has sort of two ways of projecting power into the Asia Pacific. One is that there's a navy, obviously, that can go from Pearl Harbor or other bases into the region, and the second is there are bases in the region. And the concern is that in the first, there are Chinese development of what are called anti-access weapons, including sort of ballistic missile technology that may threaten or harass the fleet in ways that would make it very slow to actually get to where it needs to get to. So it wouldn't be it wouldn't be the ally. Those forces wouldn't play the role that they need to play in terms of upholding these alliances and treaties. And the second way is to have these bases, but the bases, another word for bases can be targets, right? So they can be saturated, by attack. So no one is really clear if the bases are actually assets or not. And so part of the Darwin sort of initiative is that it's because it's so far out of the way in a way, it's actually, but close enough to project in that it's an additional way of being able to project power, again, with the purpose of trying to, uphold these various treaty commitments that have been made. So this is really about, keeping the sea lanes open, fulfilling treaty obligations and the like, rather than anything new. It's changing the strategy in order to continue doing what the Navy has been doing for decades. But because of these technological developments that make the old ways more difficult. Thank you so much. This is a lot of fun, and thanks so much for coming out on the debate night too. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you, sir, for helping us think about an incredibly complex and constantly changing challenge. Let me thank all of you for your questions. It really is just enlightening. I always learn something from these talks. I guess I shouldn't be surprised, right? Again, thanks for coming. Exactly 1 week from today, we'll have our next talk. It also has a foreign policy focus. Stephen Pfeiffer, a senior fellow in Brookings Foreign Policy, will be here. Stephen's had a long career in the Foreign Service, an expert on nuclear arms control. That'll be the theme of his topic. He's had many positions, including some service as ambassador in the Ukraine. So we're very pleased to have him here and hope to see you here next week too.